Hindu law is one of the world's oldest legal systems, with roots that go back, believe it or not, over 6,000 years. Now, I want you to think of it less like a static set of rules carved in stone and more like a great, powerful river that's been flowing through time, constantly being fed by new streams and sometimes dramatically changing its course.
And that brings us to the big question, right? How on earth does a legal system this ancient manage to adapt and still govern the personal lives of over 1 billion people today? Well, the answer is in its incredible journey of evolution. And that's the journey we're about to explore, starting from its very source.
So, to really understand Hindu law, we have to go way back to its headwaters. We're talking about the ancient sources that form its spiritual and philosophical bedrock. This is literally where the entire legal tradition kicks off.
These ancient sources really stand on 3 core pillars. First, you've got the Shrutis, considered the divine word itself. From there, you get the Smritis, which are the human efforts to remember and make sense of that divine word. And finally, you have customs, which are the living, breathing traditions that grew out of all these teachings over thousands of years.
Okay, so let's start with the Shrutis. These are seen as the most sacred source of all. The word itself literally means what is heard. And the belief here is that these aren't human compositions at all, but actual divine truths that ancient sages heard while in a state of deep meditation. The 4 Vedas are the prime example of Shruti, and they provide the ultimate ethical blueprint for life.
Now, if Shruti is what was heard directly from a divine source, Smriti is what is remembered. These are definitely human works. They're the recorded interpretations of sages who studied the Vedas and wrote down their own understanding of those truths. The famous and sometimes controversial Manu Smriti, or Laws of Manu, is a perfect example, laying out super detailed rules for society.
So, once you have these foundational texts, a new question pops up. What happens when different scholars read the same text and come up with different interpretations? Well, just as you'd expect, the river of law begins to fork. This led to different schools of thought, each one carving out its own distinct channel.
And this brings us to the 2 major schools of thought that really defined Hindu law for centuries. Under the Mittakshara school, which is followed across most of India, a son gets a right to the family's ancestral property just by being born. It's an automatic thing. But under the Dayabhaga school, which you'll find mainly in Bengal and Assam, that right only kicks in through inheritance after the father's death. This one fundamental difference, when you get your rights, completely changes everything, from the concept of ownership to how much power a father has over the property.
For centuries, this river of law just flowed along those ancient channels. But then, with the arrival of British colonial rule and, later, Indian independence, these powerful new tributaries started pouring in, and they began to dramatically alter the entire landscape of Hindu law.
During the British era, legislation became this really powerful tool for social reform, often clashing with some deeply rooted customs. You see it clearly in 1829 with the abolition of sati, the horrific practice of widow burning. This was followed by laws that were, for their time, revolutionary, like legalizing widow remarriage and giving women their very first legal foothold in property rights. These were some of the first huge waves to really reshape the river's flow.
And it wasn't just legislation. 2 other modern streams started to flow in. First, you had judicial decisions, where court rulings would set a precedent that then became part of the law. And second, there was this English common law principle of justice, equity, and good conscience, which judges would use to fill in the gaps whenever a specific Hindu law didn't exist for a situation.
But look, the most powerful force for change, by far, was the legislation that came after India's independence. This wasn't just about small reforms anymore. This was about systematically codifying and unifying the entire system of personal law for a new, democratic nation.
And there's one year in particular that stands out as a massive turning point in this entire 6,000-year history. That year is 1956. In 1956, a series of 4 acts basically triggered a revolution in Hindu law. For the first time ever, there were uniform rules for marriage, succession, adoption, and guardianship for the entire country. But the most seismic shift was getting rid of the limited estate for women. This single change granted women full and absolute ownership rights over property. It put them on an equal footing with men in a way that was pretty much unimaginable before then.
But the evolution didn't stop there. As India kept progressing, another landmark year arrived, bringing one of the most significant amendments in modern history.
So, in 2005, Parliament amended the Hindu Succession Act, proving yet again how this legal river can completely change its course. The amendment made this monumental change. It declared that daughters, just like sons, would have a right to ancestral property from the moment of their birth. This made them co-parsoners, basically equal partners in the family property. It was a massive step forward, erasing a centuries-old source of gender discrimination with one piece of legislation.
So, after this long, incredible journey from divine revelation all the way to democratic legislation, where does the river of Hindu law actually flow today? Let's take a look at what this transformed system has become.
I mean, the contrast between then and now is just stark. The main source of law has shifted from divine revelation to laws passed by a democratic parliament. The whole basis has moved from a patchwork of different customs and texts to a single, uniform legal code. And maybe most profoundly, women's rights have been completely transformed from being limited and unequal to being equal and protected by law.
This whole journey really shows that Hindu law isn't some relic of the past stuck in a museum. It's a living, breathing system that is still evolving. And that leaves us with one final, fascinating question to think about. As our society itself continues to change, where will this great river flow next?